Finding your voice. Sort through the clutter, discover clarity, confidence, and direction. Written by Joel Boggess. Narrated by Rich Germain. Chapter 1. Grasping for Hope. I stood by, waiting for the go sign. The scene had become an all-too-common ritual. My mom's boyfriend, Doyle, rank with alcohol and high on whatever he could buy on the way home from work, cocaine usually, came crashing into her house. Of course, he lived there too, but on payday Friday, neither of us wanted him around. He shouted obscenities and stormed around the house in a wild fury. He wanted to intimidate my mom physically and emotionally, but Mom didn't make that easy. The first few times I witnessed Doyle's outbursts, they terrified me. But now, as much as I hated it, the ugliness seemed almost predictable. The abuse had been going on for years, and drugs, they were just part of his everyday life. I lost count of the number of times I watched him snort coke or smoke weed. But watching him threaten my mom was another story. For this, I hated him. Here we go again, I thought as I ducked out of his path. At 10 years old, I wasn't big enough to hold him off. Besides, I'd long since learned that speaking up or jumping between Doyle and Mom only made him angrier and meaner. Instead, I watched for Mom's signal to run for help if things got bad enough. The shouting and shoving went both ways. Mom was feisty and didn't stand for being threatened. I remember the strength in her voice as she told him to get out of the house. "You're drunk, you're high. If I can't make you leave, I'll get someone who can." Finally, she nodded at me and I dashed out the door. Damp with sweat, my t-shirt clung to my pudgy tween-age body. Rocks and broken glass poked my feet as I ran barefoot to the payphone at the convenience store down the block. Still gasping to catch my breath, I grabbed the receiver and pushed 0. A faraway voice came on the line. "Operator." "We need the police," I said, working to sound grown-up and in control. My mom needed a hero, and if I couldn't fight off Doyle myself, I was determined to get someone who could. "If this is an emergency, son, you need to call 911, the operator replied. "I'll put you through, but next time you need to dial 911, do you understand?" I nodded into the phone. A few clicks later, the police dispatcher came on the line. "What is your emergency?" I had made the run before, so it felt almost routine to repeat the words. "We need the police. We need them to come to my house," I said. "My mom's boyfriend is trying to hurt her. We need help now. Just come get him. Take the jerk away," I thought. After giving the dispatcher our address, I hung up and raced back to the house. I breathed a sigh of relief when the police cruiser pulled onto my street. Like an air traffic controller, I waved the officers toward my mom's house. I'm sure at that point they told me to stay outside. I really can't remember. But I do remember them taking Doyle away. Back inside, I helped my mom clean up pieces of broken glass and to set the house back in order. As odd as it may seem, Doyle's episode didn't ruin our evening. After picking up, we went back to life as usual. I now know that Mom's cool, collected behavior and determined spirit taught me some expert, but not necessarily healthy, coping skills. We didn't discuss the ugliness. We just moved on. As bad as those years of watching my mom's abuser create chaos and confusion in our lives were, that's not where my story really begins. Broken body, broken family. The chain of events that led to the Payday Friday ritual began for me when my parents divorced. I was 3 when they separated, and I don't really remember the divorce itself, except for impressions of sadness that we were no longer all together. I have a huge memory gap for that period of time, not because I was too young, but because of what happened next. One Sunday, when I was 5, I went on a hike with my dad, one of his friends, and a couple of other kids. After a while, we came to a wide, dry creek bed with a train trestle crossing over it. Dad and his friend set us loose to play while they rested. For an adventurous and precocious 5-year-old boy and his friends, the trestle looked like a jungle gym. It didn't take long for one of us to come up with a bright idea of climbing up the side of the ravine to the bridge above while the adults' heads were turned. At the top, we tested our balance and independence by lying down on the railroad ties and peeking over the edge. Full of pride, we shouted a happy, "Hi!" to my dad and his friend below. You can guess their reaction. They jumped up and yelled for us to get down as they immediately began to climb the ravine wall to fetch us. Halfway up, Dad heard the horns sound in the distance. I was so busy playing I didn't notice the train until it was almost on top of me. The noise and vibration startled me, and I fell 30 feet, landing hard on the parched earth below. By the time Dad reached the top, the train had screeched to a halt, and I had disappeared from the bridge. A passenger standing between the cars of the idling train pointed to the creek bed and shouted, "Someone's down there!" Dad raced back down and found me lying on my side in a pool of blood. Fearing I was dead, he knelt down and felt for a pulse. With great relief, he discovered my little heart was still pumping. Barely. These were the days before anyone had cell phones, so one of the train's engineers called for an ambulance. I'd lost so much blood by the time the ambulance arrived, my veins had collapsed, and the EMT couldn't start an IV. At the hospital, a team of doctors went to work on me. They discovered 3 skull fractures, one of which punctured my right middle ear. Several hours of surgery later, my parents were told to expect the worst. Doctors predicted I would die. If I was lucky enough to live, they were certain I would have extensive brain damage. Can you imagine what life must have been like for my family while I lay there in the hospital? My recently divorced parents were in that all-too-common transition back to the single life. Their marital relationship was in ruins, their faith sorely tested, and their only child lay broken before them with bleak prospects for recovery. Beneath the terror of not knowing whether I would survive hovered the fear of what I would be like if I ever woke up. Would I be able to walk or talk? Would I experience any permanent mental, emotional, or physical damage? My dad describes this time as the most awful, horrible, guilt-ridden time of his life. A few days before the accident, he had been hired to start a new job as an editor with Southwest Research Institute. He reported to his first day on the job the day after the accident. For weeks, he went to work every day, not knowing if his son would ever come out of that coma. Mom was working through nursing school and struggling to make ends meet. We'd been living with her sister until just before the accident. We survived on food stamps and $100 a month from her aunt. The accident occurred during her finals, so, like my dad, she couldn't stay at the hospital. Doing so would have required her to drop out and restart the program. Thankfully, her classmates voted to allow her special conditions, more written reports in lieu of some of the in-person practicums, so she could make the trek from her home in Austin to the hospital in San Antonio, Texas. I can only imagine how desperate, stressed out, and helpless my parents must have felt as they waited for me to wake up. After 3 long weeks, I shocked everyone by finally coming out of the coma. But even after I revived, I had a lot of healing to do. I was incredibly weak on my right side and had to regain the strength to walk. Temporary paralysis gave me a limp, not unlike trying to walk after your leg has fallen asleep. Adding to that was the injury to my right ear, which caused permanent hearing loss on that side and threw off my sense of balance. My eyesight was also affected. Doctors assured my parents I had suffered permanent brain damage. Their prognosis? Don't expect Joel to lead a normal life. They were sure right about that. From bad to worse. The accident left long-term scars on everyone in my family. I stayed in the hospital for another month, but regaining my balance and learning to cope with the hearing loss took significantly longer. As devastating as those wounds were, they only account for my physical challenges. Mentally and emotionally, we each had bigger battles to fight. Before I get any further into this story, I want to interject an important comment. I don't place judgment or blame on my family for the things you will read here. Everyone approaches life from a unique set of experiences and knowledge. Our perspective of the world, our relationships, and our abilities develop as a result of the experiences and the information we gather on our life's journey. Our expectations for success or failure come from that perspective. As we learn and grow, our perspective and behaviors change. That certainly happened in my life and in my parents' lives. I hope the same thing happens for you as you find your voice. As Maya Angelou said, "We do the best we can with what we know, and when we know better, we do better." Feelings of guilt about the accident crushed Dad's spirit for years. Drinking and sex were his vices. Going to bars and picking up women became a regular pastime. One I joined him in far too early in life. By the time I reached middle school, I was an accomplished wingman and knew how to order my dad's Martell on the rocks at the bar. I remember one night when the car ride, on the way home from our evenings out, turned into an adventure as we veered this way and that to miss oncoming traffic. Dad lost control of the pink Ford Thunderbird he drove. Of course, there were no seatbelt laws at the time. I tried desperately and unsuccessfully to hold onto the seat, the door frame, anything to keep from flying around the car as it skidded off the road. Finally, the car landed hard in a ditch. Shaken but unharmed, Dad put the car back in gear and managed to get us home. My mom faced demons of a different sort. Her boyfriend Doyle moved in with her shortly after the accident. He was a user and abuser in every sense of the word. I lived with my dad, but visited Mom every other weekend. I hated the nights when Doyle came home drunk and high after hanging out with his friends. Mom tried to protect me from the brunt of the ugliness. She locked the doors and told him to go sleep it off and leave us alone. But if you know any mean drunks, you know just telling them to leave isn't very effective. Instead, he pounded on the door while yelling obscenities. I remember once he threw his body against the door so forcefully that the molding on the frame cracked. Sometimes he kept enough wits about him to break the glass window on the kitchen door so he could simply reach through, turn the lock, and let himself in the house. And then there were the parties. This was Austin, Texas, in the late 1970s and early 1980s. Drugs were part of the scene. Doyle and his brothers hosted parties for their friends, and I saw plenty of marijuana joints and trays of cocaine. Once, I remember feeling simultaneously impressed and disgusted as I watched someone snort cocaine through a rolled-up $100 bill. Mom attempted to keep me away from the worst of it, generally making sure I stayed out of the room where the festivities were taking place. At one party, though, Doyle handed a tray with lines of coke to his brother, who was standing a few steps behind and off to the side of me. I'd been attending their party since I was a little kid, so the drug scene felt fairly normal, or at least not out of the ordinary. But I knew that cocaine was different, more dangerous, and I knew he shouldn't be flaunting it like that around me. I found Mom in another room and told her what had happened. Man, she hit the roof. After she told Doyle off, we left the party. He ran out into the parking lot and begged her to stay. Not a chance. For all the crap she endured from that man, her mama bear instinct showed up in a big way when she felt I was being put in harm's way. As I witnessed my parents' destructive behaviors, I picked up unhealthy habits for dealing with my own challenges. With my balance issues, I became the kid who was picked last for sports, but picked on most. I could lie and say the teasing didn't bother me, but detailed records from school administrators tell the truth. Once I regained my strength, I developed quite a reputation as a fighter. I lost count of the number of times my dad left work to retrieve me from the principal's office. Kids teased me for the way I walked and talked, and I let them have it. In my dad's words, I would get on top of them and pound the hell out of them. After a while, I didn't just retaliate. I looked for the opportunity to fight, proving with my fists that I was just as good as everyone else as my way of seeking acceptance and significance. Finding hope. Looking back, it's easy to think our lives were a mess. But in those moments, I now know we were all doing our best to deal with life the only way we knew how. We each coped with our emotions, weaknesses, and needs differently. For all the hardship and struggle we endured and put ourselves through, I can also look back now and see we were grasping for hope. Hope, it's a short word that exudes enormous possibilities. Hope is the reason people pick up a book, hire a coach, apply for a new job, go back to school, open a business, or set off on a trip around the world. The faintest glimmer of hope may be all you need to see your way to the first steps in your path of development. When weather forecasters predict a big storm, one of the first things people do is go out and buy batteries for their flashlights. Why? Well, simple. We know that when the power goes out, even the tiny beam of a flashlight can enable us to see. When the storms of life hit, we instinctively reach for hope. And if the beam of light seems narrow and dim, you can recharge hope by getting a new perspective on your life and the way you fit into this world. For me, that recharge began just before middle school. My parents recognized my interest in martial arts and signed me up for classes. If you haven't studied martial arts, old kung fu movies or scenes from The Karate Kid may have given you the wrong impression. If you are a serious student, the benefits run much deeper than winning competitions. I discovered a love for martial arts and learned a great deal about determination and persistence. Later, at age 17, I began to study Taekwondo. I spent many an afternoon practicing at the dojo. The master and his sons became like a second family as they mentored me in the mechanics and the meaning of the sport. The tenets of the Taekwondo are courtesy, integrity, perseverance, self-control, and an indomitable spirit. Wow, did I need those things in my life? Don't we all? Focusing on those characteristics daily allowed them to sink into my spirit and eventually become part of me. The self-discipline I developed while studying martial arts renewed some of the confidence I had lost after the accident. Things weren't all rosy from that point on, but my practice shaped my character in a powerful way. My impaired sense of balance required me to work harder than the average student. The fact that the doctor said I couldn't do what other kids my age were capable of spurred me to prove them wrong. In my mind, their prognosis was unacceptable. My beautiful wife, Pay, once told me, "You know, honey, I think those doctors did you a favor by telling you what you couldn't do." She's right. Proving them wrong became a powerful motivator for me. So much so, I eventually earned my black belt and went on to train other students. And like those who mentored me, my role wasn't simply teaching people the mechanics of a punching or kicking motion. The real lessons were about self-confidence, overcoming challenges, and finding inner strength, something I'm still privileged to do every day. I didn't know it back then, but helping others grow was a step toward finding my voice. Here are some questions for reflection. What have you learned from past events, good or bad, about your resiliency? What habits or routines have you developed to help you cope with challenges or difficult circumstances, Are those habits or routines helping or harming you? We've all been disappointed before by leaders, by close relationships, and events or situations. Are you willing to pick yourself up, dust off, and try again? To reinforce what we've learned in this chapter, write down your thoughts in answer to these questions. What statement or story from this chapter resonated with you the most, and why? How could this help you find your voice?